Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to please find a seat. My name is Chris Chappell. I'm the Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology and Director of the Master of Arts program here at Loyola Marymount University. And I wish first to invite to the stage Dr. Roberta Espinosa, who is the Vice Provost for local, global, and all manner of initiatives that involve Loyola both within our community and beyond the bluff. So Roberta, please.
Great. I'm going to have to make a small adjustment to this. Can everyone hear me fine? Great. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Professor Chappell. And I just want to reemphasize my title, as complicated as it is a big umbrella. So as the Vice Provost for Global Local Initiatives, anything global and or local falls under my umbrella. So as you can imagine, that includes a variety of different things. I've been in this newly created position for approximately 9 months now. And this position was created by President Snyder and Provost Poon under the theme of global imagination. And it really was put in place to demonstrate their support to enhance our institutional efforts, to our commitment to comprehensive internationalization, the global part, and also the building of strategic community partnerships, and that encompasses the local part of my title. So it is quite fitting and a true honor to welcome you all to our campus this evening in this new role for this very significant and important award dedicated to intercultural communication and understanding for the promotion of world peace. Since its founding, LMU's mission and ethos are well aligned with the premise of this award. Our university has robust offerings in international studies and numerous global learning opportunities in which our students, staff, and faculty both facilitate, co-facilitate, and engage. Related to this evening's topic, I want to highlight that we have international students from Russia on our campus as part of the internationalization initiatives that we've moved forward with. And we also offer a study abroad program that includes a trip to Moscow. So I would just, in closing, I would like to thank the Doshi family for their generosity in funding the Bridgebuilder Award to honor individuals and or organizations, in this case individuals, dedicated to fostering understanding between cultures, peoples, and disciplines. Without further ado, I'd like to pass along the stage to the Doshi family, along with Professor Chappell, to present the award. Thank you so much.
We have a bit of a husband and wife theme this evening, and we're also very grateful that we have yet another woman as an award winner this evening. So Mr. Doshi and Mrs. Doshi are well known and beloved through the Los Angeles region, throughout Southern California, for their generosity and for their enthusiasm to support education for building bridges. So one at a time, they're going to come and you're coming up together? Okay, so they're coming up together, and they will stand here and introduce to you our, you'll sit, okay. So what we'll do is please come to the stage. So, Nathan.
Can I sit on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be holding the microphone.
wife always complains. I speak up and down, and some people may not hear in the back. So I'll try my best now. Thank you for gracing this event. I should say good evening, friends, first. Good evening, friends. Thank you for gracing this event by your presence. And special thanks to organizers of this wonderful university. Thank you, Robin, Chris, Dana, and other team members. Let me start with few thoughts on bridge builders. Deep meditation through introspection indeed helped Siddhartha to discover the middle path of moderation. Balanced, blissful mind, avoiding the extremes of pain and pleasure. The middle path also helped him discover the conduit to the Supreme Self, becoming Buddha. During the 1st century AD, another Buddhist middle path, Madhyamika, was articulated by philosopher Nagarjuna. The truth of the middle path was rediscovered centuries later by a Chinese scholar and traveler, Yuan Zhang, a giant of bridge building. His itinerary included traveling through the grueling terrain of Gansu, enduring the deadly heat of Gobi Desert, and desolate and treacherous ice peaks of Pamir Mountains. Xuanzang's journey to India, not for any riches. Like Siddhartha, he sought only the path of truth. During 17 years' journey, he traced both the physical and spiritual footsteps of Buddha and Nagarjuna, walking past the Hellenic statues of Gandhara, journeying along the sacred river of Ganga, and at the glorious university, Nalanda, he learned about all the Buddhist schools and embraced Yogacara, another middle path, founded on both Nagarjuna's and Buddha's middle path. These were Buddhist metaphysics discovered some 17 centuries before Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. Eastern tradition gives more importance to intuition than the intellect constituted of pure reason. Is somewhat related to intuitive and intellectual outcome. A difference had arisen between Tagore and Einstein in matters of objective observation during their philosophical discourse. Tagore intuitively disagreed with Einstein, stating that participating observer does influence the process of observation, resulting into multiple outcomes, in effect supporting Schrodinger's equation of quantum mechanics. There are many corollaries to the middle path of moderation. Bridge building and the principle of coexistence are two of them to avoid polarization between a pair of extreme opposites. This is the path of transcendence towards sunyata and informs us to stay in the present, a middle of the past and the future, the zeros of Einstein's time and space coordinates, making time and space irrelevant. As we plunge into a deep contemplation of this endless profundity, only then it is possible to discover the purity of the absolute vacuity, effulgent illumination of Nirvana.
Today, we are gathered here to honor and appreciate works of a couple, an expert professor on Russia, Stephen Cohen, and the editor of the magazine Nation, Katrina New Hope. Employing both print and electronic media, They are warning us in the loudest possible voice that the world has come closest ever to a potential nuclear holocaust. Steve and Katrina are the ones warning us that Washington is essentially responsible for replacing diplomacy with warmongering in matters of relations with Russia and the world. Diplomacy, derived intuitively and intellectually, is indeed an instrument of bridge building, finding a middle path of moderation. Katrina Heuvel is a prolific and acclaimed trailblazer. She is a brilliant and influential writer, editor, and publisher. She is a remarkable contributor to the betterment of society, and she is certainly a bridge builder. She works successfully across national boundaries, political boundaries, and ideological boundaries. Katrina is perhaps best known as editor and publisher of The Nation, the oldest continuously published weekly magazine in the United States and the most widely read weekly journal of political and cultural news, opinion, and analysis. The Nation was founded in 1865, and in July it will celebrate the 150th anniversary. Katrina is also a frequent commentator on American and international politics for leading American television networks, including ABC, CNN, and PBS. Her newspaper articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, and the Boston Globe. She also writes a weekly web column for the Washington Post, and her blog appears at thenation.com. And still further, Katrina has received awards for her public service from numerous groups.
For old-timers like me, raised during Gandhi's idealism of non-violence and Nehru's philosophy of Panchashila and non-alignment that describe ways to protect nations' sovereignties, have raised doubts about the path that the West is following. The globalization or globalized economic web controlled by the deep state is perceived to be a spider web inhabited by spiders and flies. Small countries like flies are afraid of losing their sovereignties. We Indo-Americans also have a certain affinity towards Russia because of our good historical relationship over a century and for helping India during the War of Bangladesh liberation. Yuri Gagarin's first Sputnik flight in 1961 helped me to become an aerospace engineer since America was trying to catch up with the Soviets. During Russia's 1952 trade exhibition in Mumbai, I wanted to buy a very attractive bicycle, but couldn't convince my father. But Steve, Professor Cohen, did buy a tricycle for his daughter in Moscow some 30 years later. That has been our first connection. There is a second connection now. We both have a younger wife. And not only that, the wives bring more money in the family. I discovered Steve's scholarship and expertise about Russia in 2014 when I started to hear his audio broadcast with John Batchelor on every Tuesday. I learned a lot about Russia, Ukraine, and Washington's hand in creating the crisis. I have reviewed Steve's latest book, a bit superficially. The title is War with Russia, ? As I understand, it is a book without no end. Let me read among a few reviews of others. Cohen's ideas about Russia, which once got him invited to Camp David to advise a sitting president, now make him the most controversial expert on Russia. In my view, his scholarship, in fact, remains at the peak. But the beltway and the media has changed. Just to give you an example, Farid Zakaria invited him a few times for his views, but would hardly let him finish a sentence and cut him off. Here are two more reviews of his book. Blistering, brilliant, and deeply felt critic of America's decade-long daydream of Russia in transition. There is one more. A model of scholarly journalism, sound and wonderfully readable. I would recommend reading this book and listening to his wonderful lucid analysis of current events at the John Batchelor Show on Tuesdays. Still there, right? Okay. Before and after Soviet Union's bloodless breakup, I have been reading the forecast by neocons that Russia will break up into pieces. I used to hear of India breaking up after India's independence in 1947 during my college years, thanks to the English media of those days. One reason British wanted to divide India so that they would be able to observe Soviets at its underbelly from North Pakistan. I believe Putin is doing something good for his people, since his popularity has remained over 70% for a long time. Holier than thou attitude of the West does not seem to be appropriate in a multipolar world. I'm anxiously waiting for Steve and Katrina's lucid articulation of recent events. I believe we will be enlightened and hope we all will help them to spread his dire warning. Congratulations to both for receiving this year's Bridgebuilder Award. Please give a big hand to this wonderfully accomplished couple. Thank you. I didn't have the book. It's somewhere there, right?
This. I think.
What's going on? We lost our moderator.
Okay. I need a mic.
There you are. Good.
Okay, what we're going to do now is to present the awards,
I have some.
correct? And what I'd like to do is welcome Pratima and Navin to step up and for you to come back down and we'll hand these awards to you.
Oh.
I would have worn my gym suit. I'd known I had to move around so much. All right. I'm down.
I want to apologize. I just have so many.
Yes,
I have
too many
mics,
things
mics.
to hold. Okay. So here we go.
Oh, thank you. Oh, very nice.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Very beautiful. Beautiful.
And then
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. And go ahead and look at me really quick. 1, 2, 3. One more.
Good.
1 second and cool.
Cool.
1, 2, 3. And last one. 1, 2, 3.
And one more with Roberta.
Oh. 1 second, please.
2, 1. Beautiful. One more. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Listen. So we'll go back.
I'd like now to introduce my colleague from the History Department, Dr. Nigel Raab, who is himself an expert in Russia. And although I'm so thrilled to honor both of our guests here, I know so little about Russia that this must be outsourced. So their format, which will be more conversational than presentational, will proceed with Nigel introducing a little bit more about himself, and then allowing each of the folks to present a little bit on their thinking, and then chaos will ensue.
All right, well, thank you very much. Is the microphone working? No. Not working at all. Okay.
How about mine? Yes, right?
Yes.
Is mine working?
Yes.
Yours is working too.
So yours is not turned on.
Mine is not turned on.
Yeah.
1 second. Well, there's got to be a button there.
Move that for a minute and see if it works.
No, that's not. No.
You got your lapel mic on? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a
technical assistance in the
technical
house?
assistant in the room? Well, I'll start.
Well, no.
Come on up. I'll start just with the microphone, and then hopefully we can get this stuck. This is not too bad here. So I just like to introduce myself very briefly, and then quickly we can go to the more expert views on Russia. So I study Russia. I'm a historian. So I work in the 19th and 20th century, Russia through the imperial and the Soviet period. So generally speaking, most of my experience is with archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and places in Siberia. But there's also a growing interest for historians to engage with contemporary issues. So, for example, now we have at LMU a class on Russian foreign policy where we can look at foreign policy from the past to the very present. So that's just a little bit of background about myself. I'm very excited that we have this conversation tonight because it is, especially after 1991, it's not as frequent that you can have very high-level views on Russia because the collapse of the Soviet Union had an impact on the profession. So we're going to start first by having Steve talk a little bit about his book, and then Katrina will offer an alternative view. And then what we're going to do is go into a conversation, and hopefully we can start the conversation in around 1991, and then move ourselves forward so we get a sense of how critical events in the 90s are actually impacting foreign policy and military threats today. So I will pass on the microphone. Steve.
I'm audible. Yes. And I do better just briefly standing up, and then I'll sit down. Because I was asked, excuse me, to say a few words about my perspective, which is in this little book, War with Russia ? But I have to admit that when I, and then Katrina, were first invited to come here for the Bridgebuilder Award, I wasn't sure why me, and subsequently Katrina, though she's more deserving because in her position as editor of The Nation, which serves a very large and contentious community, she literally has to build several bridges a day just to survive. I, on the other hand, it wasn't clear to me, but now that I began to think about it, it is true. I had my first encounter with Russia when I was 19 years old. Accidental. I got on the wrong ship almost. Ended up from London. And all these years studying Russia, interacting, living in Russia, first alone, and then since 1980 with Katrina, I think it's true that I have been trying to build bridges. Now, to build a bridge, you can't build it on one side of the sea or the river. You have to build it on the other side, too. Otherwise, the bridge ends badly. And I have been, in my own non-programmatic and maybe semi-conscious way, trying to build bridges between Russia and the United States, and previously the Soviet Union, by most often and obviously speaking here in a voice that's been considered non-orthodox. and now it's said I'm controversial, which I guess when you get to be my age is better than some things they could call you. But first alone, and then very much with Katrina, who has her own circle of friends in Russia, and we've been to Russian universities and talked to students, we like to do that. We're also building a bridge in Russia. We're trying to respond to Russians who don't understand why we seem to be so belligerent toward them, no matter what government they have. And it's a complicated question. We don't really know the answer, but we try to respond as best we can. We were there, was it in November, December? And we went to Moscow State University, and there were about, I guess, 150 students in the room. All of them allegedly spoke English. We weren't sure. So we did sort of English and Russian. But the questions were much more interesting than our answers, because you hear what young Russian people are wondering about us. So in this book, very briefly, let me summarize, and just in a few flash words each, what's in this small book, War with Russia, ? First, there is the once controversial argument I've been making for more than 15 years that we're in a new Cold War with Russia. People now agree. They may quibble with the language, but there's no big argument of that. The second argument, though, now I am unable to persuade people that we need to understand that this Cold War was instigated inadvertently or programmatically in Washington, not Moscow. Thirdly, and this is what worries me most, this new Cold War is more dangerous than the one that I can't see the generations here. My new friend with whom I had a discussion about LA basketball didn't experience, nor did my grandson, but most of us experienced some aspects of the previous Cold War. I believe this one's more dangerous. And we can't simply say, well, we survived the first one, we're going to be okay. So that's a big argument of the book. Another is that, and this has been very contentious, and I'm not dogmatic about it, but I have found evidence that our intelligence services, particularly the CIA and the National Security Agency, did certain things, certainly by early 2016, that created what we now call Russiagate. That is the set of allegations that somehow the Kremlin put Trump in the White House, or that they have stuff on him that makes him, quote, their puppet. I find no evidence for this, but what I do find evidence for is that certain forces in high levels in intelligence services fostered this idea. Why they did it and exactly how is not clear. And I don't insist on it, but I set it out because I want people to think about it. But, and this is another theme of the book, when I say such things, and not I alone, others, there are a group of us in the United States, I'd say maybe 4 or 5 people who have some proximity to the mainstream media, we are accused of being Kremlin apologists, or apologists for Putin, which is an echo, and you all know what this was. I came in at the tail end of it, what was once called McCarthyism. That instead of saying to your intellectual opponent, you're wrong, and here's why, and here's what I think, they say, you're a communist sympathizer, or you're a Kremlin apologist. And that's a discussion killer. Where do you go from there? No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. And it's kind of censoring. It sort of ends the conversation. It's also demeaning. And then another theme of the book, and I'll come to the last one in a minute, is I think that our mainstream media has done a really bad job of covering Russia, covering Putin, covering Russiagate, and covering these new allegations. It has not been balanced, it's been highly selective, that they've gone to a set of sources when during the old Cold War, they always had to have opposing points of view. It was a rule at the Times during the preceding Cold War that if you were covering a controversial or new breaking story, you had the 2 points of view that were opposing about the significance of this event. Now they know who they want, it's the only person they go to, and the people they go to, and it's the same thing with their op-ed page. People of my point of view cannot get on the New York op-ed page any longer, whereas during the preceding Cold War, they'd ring up and say, what have you got? Got something controversial? They don't want controversy about this. And finally, and this I find startling, but I think I'm beginning to understand why. Very much unlike when I got involved in all this in the 70s and 80s, there is no organized, effective opposition in the United States to the new Cold War. Think about that for a minute. I mean, we're living in a country where there's an opposition to everything, however ridiculous, and yet to this new Cold War, with all its dangers, there's none. Not in the media, not in the White House. Well, I don't know what Trump thinks. Sometimes he's this, he's that. But not in Congress, not at the grassroots, not in the universities. There's no organized opposition. And during the preceding Cold War, there was a formidable opposition, funded, by the way, by the CEOs of major American corporations that wanted to trade in the Soviet Union. Now about 160, right, from Starbucks to Wendy's to various motor companies, energy companies, are making big profits in the Soviet Union, but their CEOs are absolutely silent about this new Cold War. And that is very different. And that's one reason, or another reason, I think this one's more dangerous. So we'll discuss all that, whatever you want to discuss tonight. But those are my perspectives at my age in, what are we, February 2019. And thank you very much for inviting us here.
Thank you very much, Steve. And now, Katrina, if you'd like to say a few words of your own.
Yes, I would stand, but I have so many wires, forgive me. I want to thank the Doshi family, not only for their generosity to us this evening in considering us deserving of this extraordinary award, but also to LMU, but to understanding that in all times, especially these times, bridge building is important. We are a country now too consumed with building walls or fighting walls. We need to remind ourselves of the importance of building bridges. Nigel said I might have an alternative view from Steve's. It is exciting to live with the most controversial Russia expert in America in these years. It has, I don't know about younger wives anymore. I'm feeling that I've been, the nation turns 154 years old this July, and some days I feel 154. But more seriously, just briefly, the nation was founded by abolitionists committed to ending slavery, committed to finding a peaceful way forward consistent with the best values of this country. Our civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 67 was Martin Luther King Jr. And I went back and looked on the 50th anniversary of his Riverside Church speech, in which he came out against the Vietnam War and spoke of the dangers of militarism, racism, and materialism. And it was shocking to me to go, I don't know why I shouldn't have been shocked, but I went to the New York Times and the Washington Post editorials of the next day in 1967, and they denounced King. They denounced King for being un-American, for speaking out against the war. The nation commended Dr. King for speaking for peace and for understanding that peace is more than just the absence of war, and for building a set of norms. I simply would say it's been extraordinary to travel with Steve to Russia. We've been going since 1980. We could not get a visa from 1980 to 82 because of involvement with dissidents.
82, 85.
I'm sorry, we couldn't get we went in 80, 81, we couldn't get a visa from 82 to 85. We can talk more about this, but a week after Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, we received a visa. And I just would say that I have seen, we're now in the second or third Cold War, possibly. You could argue that the first Cold War was 1917 until Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union. But whatever the case, we are in a new Cold War. But Cold Wars, whether early or later, I would submit, are lousy, are terrible. Not just for progressives or liberals, but for citizens who care about the danger of Cold Wars. They empower the worst forces in both countries. They empower war parties. They empower those who want to fill military defense budgets as opposed to rebuilding countries. And they close or narrow the space for dissent, for alternative views. I've worked with independent journalists, feminists, NGOs over these last 30 years or more in Moscow, and I have seen what Cold War does to close, narrow, shut down the space for forces which are needed to build bridges. And I would say that I have also seen in these last years how when you speak out, as Steve has so lucidly, and we try at the Nation to argue against this escalating nuclear war, against Cold War, for sanity, for common sense, that you get called names or that you are stigmatized as being pro-Kremlin, when in fact you have independent views which are in sync with your country's best traditions. So it's been a very complicated time. I think all of you, I'm sure, feel how it's almost Alice in Wonderland scrambled times, because I believe we need to stand by our first principles of peace, not war, of diplomacy and dialogue, not posturing, and not be reflexively anything, so that when the menace in the White House, Steve and I, opens negotiations with North Korea, you don't denounce it. You may question how it's proceeding, but you seek it, or better relations with Russia. Dialogue, diplomacy, and I think that's the best of the bridge building that the Doshi family has lifted up with this award, so thank you.
Yeah. Very good.
I would just like to second a few comments made there. One about the New York Times, which is a very respected newspaper, but they cannot bring themselves to say anything nice about Russia, and it really just takes on the same tone that just doesn't change. And so there's and the New Yorker is very similar to that as well. So it's very, for me, it's also a very tiring sort of way of representing Russia. But the relations between Russia and the United States were not always that bad. And I want to take the conversation back to 1991. Boris Yeltsin is elected. He's the first elected president in the history of Russia. He's elected as president of Russia, not of the Soviet Union. At that time, Boris Yeltsin undoes all the distant republics. Ukraine can have its independence, Lithuania, Latvia. And this was a time when the Russians were really reaching out to the Americans. And the Americans, and I know, for example, that you've both worked on a book called Voices of Glasnost, and so now we're thinking about Voices of the Yeltsin Years, but also about talking about a failed crusade, where the United States and the Soviets came together, or the Russians, and they actually were working together very, very well. So I was wondering if you could both comment on the Yeltsin years and sort of the nature of the relationship between the United States and Russia at that time.
Well, the 90s were tragic. They were a tragedy in Russia. Russia fell into it's said, I think it's correct, the worst ever economic depression in peacetime. I don't know the exact statistics. I wrote a book about it called Failed Crusade, but about 2/3 of their industrial production was vaporized. People not only lost their jobs, but their professions. They lost their Social Security benefits. They lost their real income. Men start dying at age 57. Women, for some reason, survive in all times. It's something we have to study, I think. But it was a tragedy for Russia. And meanwhile, in Washington, the Clinton administration was calling it a miraculous transition to democracy. And this was a grave error for us to have done this while Russia was in such misery. It had to do with some geopolitics that led Clinton and his advisors to think that Boris Yeltsin was the best partner America had ever had in Russia. And to this day, these American elites who have this fixation on what kind of Russia we need to bring into being, they refer to Yeltsin as the kind of leader we want. Maybe more sober and one who doesn't drink as much. Some actually say that, we want a sober Yeltsin. So Russia's tragedy became America's triumph. And you knew this was going to have a bad end. And the result was Yeltsin was forced to resign, though partly by his health, but also he was forced out in 1999, and thus came Putin. And I can assure you, based not only historical study, and you study Russia in some of its most traumatic moments, so you've seen Russia at its best and its worst, I think it's fair to say. And I think you would agree with me that the result could have been a lot worse than Putin. I mean, you would know this from studying Russian history. but you would know this from going to Moscow regularly, as the three of us do, I guess, to work in archives and do things, that we've seen the face of the alternative. Now, there are nice faces, but there are a lot of not nice faces. So the 90s become a turning point. Today, to end this story, the pro-Yeltsin wing of the political spectrum in Russia that still exists is busy trying to rehabilitate the 1920s. They're not going to have much success, and I'll tell you why.
90s, right?
The 1990s, sorry. I have a thing about the 1920s.
20s. The 20s are interesting too.
And here's the reason. People thought and would write, to their shame, American journalists, that, quote, only old people were victimized, old Russian people, by which they meant people, I guess, 60 and above, by the horrible depression of the 1990s. And that's a terrible thing to say, but they went on to say Russia would be better off without this Soviet generation. You probably heard this. Russia needs to start anew with people who didn't grow up in Soviet times. That's just cruel and genocidal. What kind of talk is that? But their children and their grandchildren knew what was going on to their grandparents and their parents. These were family tragedies. And so this isn't forgotten just because one generation is past or is passing. The 90s are going to be remembered as a time of Russian tragedy when the United States called it victory, called it democracy, and if they didn't gloat, Russia's misery made America very happy. And Putin has commented on this, not in a malicious way, but he's mentioned it a couple times. He's 67, so he's kind of a child of the 1990s. It's widespread, and that's where the 90s stand now, I think, in Russian political consciousness and in history writing, I think.
I was going to step back just a bit earlier and go, I mentioned Gorbachev earlier, because I think we forget the role Gorbachev played in opening up the possibility of democratization for Russia through glasnost, the easing or ending of censorship through perestroika, the restructuring, and then the end of the Communist Party. But Gorbachev had a vision. If you've never read, I think it was the UN speech, Steve, in 1986, 87
no,
maybe?
December 1988.
88.
Yeah.
He laid out a vision of the world which is...
You mean the big disarmament
It was
speech,
about
yeah.
disarmament. At a moment now when we're not on the cusp, we're in the midst of an escalating nuclear arms race, more perilous than we've seen ever, perhaps. He had a vision, as you may remember, of the abolition of nuclear weapons. That takes steps. It doesn't happen overnight, but he understood you needed the mutual disarmament. You needed to build down nuclear weapons, that they were not usable. He also had a vision of what he called a common European home, which was a demilitarized Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon. Instead of, and we didn't talk about this, one of the gravest errors of the 90s was the expansion of NATO, which we live with today. There was resistance to it, and the eminent diplomat George Kennan saw immediately it would trigger a new Cold War, as it has, and it is at the root of what I'm sure we'll talk about, Ukraine and other conflicts. But Gorbachev opened the door to democratization. And what's interesting in the coverage of Putin is that he's treated as the de-democratizer. But de-democratization began under Yeltsin, whose troops fired on Russia's own parliament. And it was applauded in this country on all the cable. So I think we need to remember that de-democratization began earlier in the 90s, that there was a looting of the country and the creation of an oligarchical elite, which continues to afflict Russia and US-Russian relations. We read about these oligarchs in Russiagate. And I think finally, that it's always, I find it telling because it's hard for people to cover and understand so much, but Putin's first act in power was to give the Yeltsin family immunity. He was selected for that reason. And I think it shows the corruption that has corroded Russia. I take heart that there is a new generation, which is not covered in the media. There's a new generation of activists. There are new municipal elections. There are people around Russia trying to fight corruption. But the 90s, and I thank Nigel for raising it, are critical to understanding the Russia of today, and the news coverage so often in this country either obliterates the 90s or treats it as this halcyon time.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. It's very interesting, some of these comments, because again, when you think of the 90s and the chaos, and now you go to Moscow, or even if you go to a provincial city, these cities have been renovated, improved, and they've moved themselves out of that period of the 90s, which was so difficult. I do have a question, because we're talking about all the difficulties of the 90s, and I know this is mentioned in the book, and it's one of the most misquoted, I would say, statements that Putin has made, when he said the worst thing that ever happened, and I'm translating freely because there's two translations in Steve's book, the worst thing that ever happened was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is used over and over again in the news to say Putin wants to bring back the Soviet Union,
Right.
and yet there's some pretty good alternate views to that interpretation. So if I could see what, Steve, you think about that.
So you all have heard this famous statement attributed to Putin. It's translated in English as it's hard to translate the word raspad, but the
Collapse?
I guess collapse or disintegration or destruction of the Soviet Union, Putin is said to have said, was the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. Well, that would be an outrageous thing to say. It would mean that it was a greater catastrophe than World War II, a greater catastrophe than the Holocaust, and a greater catastrophe than so many of the catastrophes of the 20th century, which was a century of catastrophes. But Putin didn't say that. Russian language, unlike English, doesn't have the article the. There's no the. You create the equivalent of the by how you decline a word and what form of a word you said. So I had the Russian in front of me, and my Russian is not high quality. And I sent it to 3 leading American translators. And the correct translation is, Putin said, the end of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. And went on to say, for the Russian people. And it unmistakably was, in the sense that what we've said about the 90s flowed out of the end of the Soviet Union. So for a Russian, I would say 65–70%, who didn't do well, didn't become oligarchs, didn't become prospering capitalists, didn't loot, who lost basically everything, it was one of the greatest catastrophes. Now, Putin said one other thing, which I think is how most Russians I know, though Katrina knows some younger ones than I know, I think that's how most Russians have thought for about the last 10 or 15 years. And he said this: anyone who does not regret and he's talking about his fellow Russians now, he's not talking about, Washington. Anyone who does not regret the end of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who thinks we can recreate the Soviet Union has no head. So Putin, this wasn't a speechwriter's device for Putin. It came up when he was discussing the question, and it's probably how he's felt for the last 20 years or more. And it seems to be about right for most thinking Russians. And it's understandable. I don't see why any of us should think it's aggressive or frightening or worrisome. It's just how do you relate, and this is part of bridge building, I think. That you bridge build in part by trying to first understand what other people's perspectives are, and then figure out a way to relate your perspectives in a non-conflictual way to those perspectives. And I don't think it would be hard for Americans to understand, if they knew a little Soviet and Russian history, to relate what Putin said. That we regret it, but we can't bring it back, and let's move on. Which is basically what he's done for the last almost 20 years, is try to move on.
Katrina?
I think the demonization of Putin has defined U.S. media coverage. the inability to bring history to bear and to put Putin in the context of Russian Soviet history. But I do think Steve, who gave a brilliant lecture on the Nation cruise about who Putin is, who Putin isn't, and begins the book with an article, Who Putin Isn't, would agree that Putin has, in the vertical, so to speak, the power centralized, has been excessive, that we're witnessing in Russia as we speak more protest. There was reference to Putin's poll numbers, but they're trying to raise the retirement age. They're not investing as effectively as they could in a country that desperately needs investment. There is still a grip on the Kremlin's economics as very austerity monetarist. I mean, this is inside baseball in a way, but we have a friend who's an economist who works with the Putin administration, who is a Rooseveltian in a way. He believes in public investment, and that's just not fully on the agenda. So I think there is growing anger inside Russia among those who are confronting pension increases, who are confronting salary decreases. And even though Putin remains fairly popular among a younger generation, it's not clear what their future will bring, and that's the case, I think, for millions of young people around this country. But I do think that just in the interest as an editor and a journalist, there are so many stories that have gone uncovered about Russia in these last few years because of the conflicts. Russia's a country of a tormented, extraordinary, rich, complex history. And yet we get the demonization of Putin, we get stories about hybrid warfare, and we get a Russiagate narrative that is, I would argue, and I think Steve even more so, is disconnected from the reality of the US-Russian relationship. And we certainly don't get what is important for any democracy, a full range of views. The disconnect between how ordinary Americans, if I could use that term, are experiencing the world, where Gallup poll showed on the eve of the midterms in 2018 that 57% of Americans want a more cooperative relationship with Russia. Yet what we get is an establishment which is eager for a more vigorous Cold War and for more vigorous prosecution of Russiagate. So I think it's very important to understand that there are alternatives, that we need a more robust debate, and that ordinary Americans are not being listened to in fundamental ways, which has led to some of the problems we confront as a country.
Thank you. I think in this, when you were listening to Putin and the way you had a very one-sided view of him in the United States, it makes me think of the Washington Post, whose correspondent in the last week reported on the State of the Union address in Moscow, it's worth watching. And it was the segment taken from the State of the Union address was just at the very end, when Putin was basically saying, if you put weapons on our borders, we have no other option but to fight back. But when you look at that whole talk, he begins with demographic issues.
Right.
He talks about medicine and how to supply the country with medicine. And only at the very end, he's like, well, yeah, wouldn't you do the same? And the other thing I'll just add to that one is his style of talking is very accessible. And you see that in the State of the Union address, but also he's got a yearly TV show called Direct Line, where you can phone in, and he's very casual and very, very accessible, even though you'll read in an American newspaper that this is all like fixed questions that are being thrown in there.
Yeah.
But on this note, my next question, because Katrina, you brought this up, and that's about NATO. And if you ask me, NATO is the single largest issue dealing with a new Cold War. And so I guess my question is, what is the answer to the NATO problem? Keeping in mind that in the 1990s, Yeltsin basically begged the Americans, don't expand NATO, and this was a continual theme. So what is the solution to the NATO problem? Is it right for the American government, assuming it's always going to keep NATO, for the American government to actually expand with NATO? What are your thoughts on that one?
How many of you were not, because I think the majority were, following news in 1991? How many of you were too young? Too young. All right. So the majority in the room were following news when the Soviet Union ended. So think back to the 90s. there was a fairly full-throated discussion with a question mark after it, both in think tanks in Washington and on university campuses and even in newspapers. What are we going to do with NATO now? There was that discussion. Does NATO have a mission? The Soviet Union is gone. Soviet Union was, for those of you who don't know but have studied it, you know that NATO was created to protect Europe against the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union is miraculously, for better or worse, gone, but what do we do with poor NATO? And a lot of people in Europe were saying, well, we don't need a NATO anymore, and the Americans can go home. And some Americans were saying we don't need to pay all this money for NATO, and it's the peace dividend, they called it, the Cold War peace dividend, right? Now, flash forward to today. I didn't vote for Trump. I'm not an admirer of Trump. But sometimes Trump asks the right question, because it appears he doesn't know the answer. And he may not even know the right question the way he asked him sometime. But he said, you know, I'm wondering, is NATO really worth all the money? And everybody went, oh my God, what's Putin got on him? Right? Am I wrong? I'm not making this stuff up. You couldn't make it up. And yet, all Trump was doing in his own crude way was asking the same question that all the big brains in America had asked in the 1990s. What happened in between? NATO found a mission. And what's the mission? The mission was to move as close as it could, gobbling up like Pac-Man, all the countries in between to Russia's borders, where it now sits in the Baltic region, in Ukraine, not got troops there, but got a lot of advisors there in former Soviet Georgia. Katrina said that we were warned by the best and most mature minds in America that if we expanded NATO toward Russia, there would be big trouble and at a minimum, a new Cold War. We've got the new Cold War. I'm arguing in the book it could be worse, that this expansion of NATO has created the possibility of hot war. So, it was, I think, a mistake of historic proportion. It should have been opposed by more people than whom actually did oppose it. It wasn't inevitable. It was among the worst, if not the worst, decisions that President Clinton made. He's never rethought it. And the consequences are playing out today. Above all, as we talk, in Ukraine, which is an unfolding tragedy that could lead to war. So the NATO expansion, though it's been good for the NATO bureaucracy and for some European countries, has been, I think historians will look back and say, a grievous mistake. And it wasn't as though they weren't told.
I mean, so the 70th anniversary of NATO is this April.
I didn't know that.
And their foreign ministers are going to gather in Washington to celebrate NATO.
Right.
I think to abolish NATO at this stage is probably, though I like radical ideas, not feasible, but I think to demilitarize as much as one can. I mean, Ukraine should be ideally a bridge between East and West, and not with West or East. But it goes back, and we were asked this question the other day at a forum. Someone said, well, Czechoslovakia, for example, wanted to be in NATO, to be grounded in Western security and democracy. The sadness is there are always alternatives, and NATO is a military institution. So what it means is to be grounded in the Western institutions is to be militarized. Because part of NATO also is streamlining military equipment so that these defense contractors make a big buck because you have to start buying their equipment. And the growth of NATO has been fueled partly by that. So I think demilitarization of NATO as much as possible, the halting of the expansion of NATO, the creation or highlighting of alternative security institutions, to me, military security is antithetical to real security. And military security or military might is inadequate to deal with, in my mind, and Steve and I disagree a little bit about this, the central challenges of our time. Climate crisis, global inequality, global pandemics. democracy building. NATO is a military institution, and it has found a somewhat different mission in Afghanistan. But again, and I echo Steve to a point that we disagree about this, sometimes Trump does ask the right question, but he then the next day steps on his own head because he steps on a lot of things. He steps on people, he steps on, why are we still in Afghanistan? And shouldn't we find a better mission for NATO than, quote, destabilizing Afghanistan? So there's an inevitability that one has to continue to fight because people just see NATO now as part of the landscape, when I think to remind people and retrieve in our own history and that there were alternatives, and to remind that it is a military institution, it's not a coffee klatch, or Steve likes to say, the ARP, you can just join. I think it's an important reminder, but it's that and the way the United States treated the end of the Soviet Union, the triumphalism was also, I think, a measure of how we've got to this point.
Yeah, many, many Russians do not like that
triumphalism.
That just don't go in that direction. So some of the things we've been discussing about are American aggression towards Russia, whether it's in the form of NATO or whatever. And when you look at the title of Steve's book, War with Russia, Russia is in that title the passive actor. But one of the things that's happening is that we have seen, and this you can also see in, I think, in last year's State of the Union address, Russia is actually rearming itself, which I don't think is that surprising. It's a big country, and the moment the economy got back on a track, it was going to do that. But we've seen this in the news, and it's presented to us. Today, Steve and Katrina got the Bridgebuilder Award. The Russians are also in contest for their own Bridgebuilder Award because over the last, I think it was within a few months ago, they've opened a bridge from mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. It's a bridge, it's about 10 miles long, you can have trains, you can have cars. The idea being, this is ours, it won't go away. One of the things in the news, and I think, I have not read otherwise in the New York Times or the Washington Post, is this is an illegal annexation of territory. And yet, I don't think everybody agrees with that. And if you look at the State of the Union address from Putin, I think it was either earlier this week or last
week, yeah.
Last Thursday, he just laughs at this. For him, this is humorous because he knows everybody in the room says it's Crimea, it's Russia, it won't change. So I was just wondering, Steve, your opinion, and Katrina, on the annexation of Crimea. Are they going against international law, or what's the case?
Well, they say, and lawyers can find a case for anything. That's why we have so many lawyers and they make so much money and all the rest. Russia's international lawyers, and they have a ton of them, say that what they did in Crimea was the will of the Crimean people. They held a referendum, and international law clearly recognizes that if there's a referendum and people want to change their affiliation, they have the right to do so. And moreover, they add, and this is their stronger case actually, they didn't do anything different than what we did when we took Kosovo from Serbia in 1999 by bombing Serbia into submission. The only difference was we used bombs and Russia used a referendum. There was no, Obama once said there was a referendum in Kosovo, but he was wrong. There was never a referendum in Kosovo. He didn't lie, he just was confused. He didn't know, didn't remember. But Crimea is a tragedy for everybody because it's planted a little ticking time bomb in relations with Russia, the West relations with Russia for a long time. And there are ways to surmount it and get around it and move on, but it's going to take so much energy. Historically, Crimea was Russian. If you count up the years it was Russian, it's over as Russian. The majority of the population are not necessarily ethnic Russians, but they're native Russian-speaking people. So by any measure, and nobody ever said the referendum was not kosher. Gallup came in and polled there about every 3 or 4 years in Crimea. How many Crimeans wanted to be in Russia? How many wanted to go back to being an autonomous territory in Ukraine, and they get the same numbers, 84 to 90% want to be in Russia. Katrina and I think, and we've talked about this with people we know in Crimea, who know people in Crimea, like leaders, and we've talked to people who work for Putin. Would a new referendum under, say, UN auspices get rid of this festering wound in East-West relations? So you're going to get the same result. I mean, it's just, Gallup tells us that. They keep polling. You're going to get the same result. But would it be regarded as legitimate, an end of the discussion, and we can all move on? And I think politically, it comes down to this. The Crimean leadership wants a new referendum to empower and legitimize themselves. One understands that. The Kremlin, in the abstract, would like it, but won't do it for two reasons. First, it looks like they did something wrong with the first, right? It makes sense, like, oh, we did something wrong, we'll have a redo. But more importantly, they know that Washington still won't accept it. That if they thought that that would end the discussion and Crimea would be regarded as a legitimate part of Russia, probably the Putin leadership would go for it. This is what the word we're getting back.
Right.
But everything they hear from Washington, before and during the Trump administration, is Washington, this is too good for Washington to beat Russia over the head with. They'll never let go of it. So we're going to have to live with it. The only thing we can say is you remember, or if you don't remember, you could look it up, that Washington did not recognize the incorporation of the 3 Baltic states into the Soviet Union after World War II, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. How did we handle it? Well, basically, in law, we didn't recognize it. In politics, we didn't pay attention and just went on. And I guess that's what's going to happen eventually with Crimea if, because you just drew attention, there's not a war over it. Because on November 25, last year, Russian gunboats engaged in a shootout with Ukrainian gunboats who tried to go under the bridge without a Russian pilot, which you must have no matter what flag you're flying, because the straits are narrow and dangerous. And you have to notify, I don't remember how many hours in advance, but 14 hours in advance that you're coming through. You have to present your papers, and you have to take on a Russian pilot. And these Ukrainian gunboats just made a dash for under the bridge. And the Russians stopped them, shot at them, captured them, and they still haven't released them. I think it was a provocation by Kiev. I can't see any other reason. First of all, why are armed Ukrainian gunboats headed toward that bridge anyway? What was their purpose? And the bridge, of course, was a great Russian engineering feat. They built, I think it's more than 14 miles, but it's a big, long bridge. And I don't know if you know it, but it's got several transverses, and they've opened the one for trucks and cars, and soon the train will be coming through. So and they spent billions of dollars on it. So they're not going to give that up symbolically or physically or diplomatically in any way. And yet, I worry that there are forces, I know in Ukraine and maybe in Washington, that wouldn't mind a war over the Kerch Bridge.
Yeah.
And that's worrisome, and that's why I say the new Cold War is more dangerous.
I was just going to say that this conversation is too reasonable. I mean, it's
you know me.
I mean,
come on, you know me. I'm
I find Nigel's questions historically informed, and the conversation is very reasonable. But if you were watching TV tonight, any TV, or reading some of the papers we've been talking about, the narrative is so ingrained that the question of how we shift that narrative is one I think a lot about. And I don't have clear answers. I have more questions than answers. But it is, I come back to the disconnect where I do think millions of Americans are open to seeing not friendship, but sort of a working partnership with a country to reduce nuke problems and to find rules of the road to cyber war. Yet the establishment, based largely in Washington and in Brussels, and is determined to make this a new Cold War. And in fact, some of you may know that the new National Defense Strategy, which defines our country's stance, was changed a few months ago so that the global war on terror, which in my view should never have been a war, has now been downgraded to make room for Russia and China as our main enemies, to be combated in all ways. So there is a set of narratives defined by the establishment and defined by a media. And let's be honest, a lot of people have their reality defined by media, even though one has to trust in the wisdom of Americans sometimes to step back and say, no, that's not the gravest threat to my security. What about the factory that just left town? Or, you know, the opioid crisis, which has killed more than... So I'm just thinking aloud, but I think the bridge building, the conversations like this, hearing Nigel's common sense humanity reminds that there are possibilities. But I'll tell you, my husband makes me watch cable TV. I do it sometimes, but to watch cable TV right now, and I'll stop. First of all, I don't fully agree with Steve on his Intelgate theory that it was, I mean, I think there is a role that was played in fundamental ways. But every night on Too Much of Cable, we're hearing from these former intelligence chiefs, these former FBI chiefs, who have not contributed in healthy ways to our democracy. I mean, 2 of them perjured themselves. They've overseen torture rendition, yet they are being treated as voices of conscience by liberals and progressives in particular. And I fear that a younger generation, which doesn't know the history of abuses by some of these agencies, is being raised to think that they are arbiters of our truth, democracy, and justice. So I'm just thinking out loud, but I have a lot more questions than answers, and I share them with you.
Well, I can't let one remarkable moment pass. My wife literally just said I was being too reasonable. Now, we've been together 40 years, and only I can remember her telling me,
when you speak history, you're reasonable.
you just aren't being reasonable.
When you get into Russia,
let me grab that book, Nigel, just for a second. So let me tell you how this little book came about. So I started doing in 2013-14 every week the John Batchelor Show. I don't know how many of you listen to John, but John's a national broadcast out of New York. And at first, I just kind of winged it, because I can talk indefinitely about anything. I wasn't gonna.
This is true.
And we went on the air live at 10 o'clock, but it was wearing me down, so we decided to tape early at 7.
7 p.m.
Yeah, not 7 in the morning. I'm not up at 7 in the morning. And I decided I have to take it more seriously, because this was the only mainstream media outlet was left to me, was the Batchelor Show. So after I began to develop it, and we had a whole hour, which is quite a bit on the radio, 40 minutes without commercials, I realized that I needed to write this up. So every night, overnight, I'd write it up to post at the Nation. And she goes to bed at about 11. I go to bed around 5.
6.
Thereabouts. And I would send it to her computer, and the next day, I'd get back on my computer in bold letters, "This is unreasonable. You can't say that. Be reasonable!" Exclamation point. I am not posting this. You can't say that. I mean, it was unbelievable.
I was trying to make your arguments more engaging and persuasive for those who didn't agree with you.
I am not saying that she was wrong. She was an enormous pain in the morning. Well, it was actually, when I got up, it was a budding noon. But I did make a lot of the changes that she suggested, because I wanted to get my argument accepted. And even if she thought I was right, she thought I needed to find another way to say it. She made this little book possible in every fundamental way. But generally speaking, she felt that I needed to be more reasonable in various ways. And so I've come to the Doshi Bridgebuilder Award, and you've built a bridge to my wife for me. So I am going to take my award and her award and put them side by side, and every time she tells me I'm unreasonable, I'm going to point to that. So thank you for this evening.
That is, thank you so much. I think we'll move to questions on that one. Let's give a round of a... So have we collected questions, or were we just taking questions from the audience? Ah, there's a question. Oh, bring him over.
Right here?
Yeah,
Yeah,
bring him
bring him
here.
up.
Oh, okay.
Do you have 4 answers?
I'm looking forward to your answers.
Thank you.
There are people bringing their questions up.
That's great.
Anybody remember Groucho Marx and the quiz show he used to run on
Oh,
TV? He'd look at the questions, he goes, I've got a question for you. You knew you were in trouble.
Okay, so here we have a hypothetical case, but I think it's a good one because I think we were discussing NATO. And the question is, what would happen if Russia invades a weak NATO member like Estonia? Should NATO retaliate?
It came up the other day in a different forum, that question.
Don't put your hand over your mic, though. Be
It's
careful.
it's yours.
It's mine? I'm the Estonian expert? Why does everybody say Estonia? I mean, why can't we say Latvia for this week,
right,
and then next week Lithuania?
No, but it's a serious question.
No, it's not. It's not really. Wait a minute.
Just-
Every question is serious.
One quick
Go ahead.
explanatory note is that this is one of those little tiny Baltic states that are really not far from St. Petersburg and have gone back and forth in history
Right.
from independence to
It's true.
under some form of Russian rule.
Right.
And now they're independent.
That's right.
I mean, I find this the trouble. You can always contrive a question that is so lacking in rational sense and knowledge that there's no answer to it ultimately. I can't imagine why the Putin leadership would want to invade any of the Baltic countries. Now, I can imagine the Putin leadership escalating the war in the Donbass region of Ukraine, where a civil war is already underway and which is now a proxy war. That is, in Donbass, which is largely a Russian-speaking territory of Ukraine, correct? Russia is supporting the rebels who are defying Kiev rule, and we're supporting Kiev, which is trying to suppress the rebels. So that's a proxy war. Everybody agrees. That's dangerous because the escalatory factor, as students of international affairs use the word, is multi-present. One can imagine various things happening that would provoke either Washington or Kiev or Moscow to escalate in Donbass, which would be very, very bad. I cannot imagine any reason why Putin would want to invade one of those countries. He's having trouble paying his own pensions. He now wants to pay Estonian pensions. You invade a country, you own it. That's what Colin Powell said, right?
The Pottery Barn rule.
Yeah, you own it.
You break
gotta
it,
pay
you
the
break it,
pensions,
you own it.
You got to provide jobs, got to provide energy, and you don't just give subsidies. It's on your dole now. Let me just say one word and I'll quit. At the root of the one of the problems with the misunderstanding about Russia today is this demonization of Putin. When I finished this book, I realized something was missing. Literally a week before I promised it to the publisher, I hadn't written about Putin in history. The reason I hadn't is I did write a biography, a successful biography, many years ago, about a man who died the year I was born.
Nikolai Bukharin.
It's very hard to write a biography of a living person who's still writing his or her own biography, right? You get to a point where you got to stop or start guessing. So I didn't become a biographer of Putin, but I realized I needed to put something in this book. So what I put in the book is who Putin is not. I wanted to strip away what I thought were the myths about Putin that had become politically dangerous in Western decision-making. For example, that he kills his personal enemies. But what struck me is that nobody talks about what Putin's mission was when he came to power, which I think is the single most important thing. When he came to power in a country that was in ruination, that was in ruins in every sense of the word. And his mission was to rebuild Russia. economically and as a world power. Now, we could argue whether he did it poorly or well, whether there were better ways to do it. For example, Katrina alluded to the so-called vertical. That's a word Russians use for the way the Kremlin, going back to the czars, has tried to govern the largest territorial country in the world. And all you have to do is read Gogol or the Inspector General to realize the consequences, some of them comedic, that this attempt to govern this vast country leads to. So Putin tried to restore the vertical. Maybe he overdid it at the expense of democratization. That's a good argument, why not? But you got to explain what he did wrong and what he could have done, both to bring Russia back together, get Russia on its feet, without retreating as much as he did from democracy, though as Katrina said, the retreat from democracy took place in the 90s, before Putin. So the reason I mention that is his mission, both his political mission, what he was charged with doing by those who put him in power, and by history, because certain mandates are written on the historical wind. I mean, they come, and leaders face them. This is part of what you do when you study leaders. The mission was to rebuild Russia. Why would he want to invade the Baltic countries, which could do nothing but undermine his mission to rebuild Russia, whether it's Russia's reputation in the West, or Russia's federal budget, or Russia's security on its border? It would have been antithetical to his mission, and it remains antithetical. So that's why I say it's too long-winded, I know, but let's get Putin out there, that this notion that what should we do if he invades Estonia? Well, by law, since Estonia is a member of NATO, Article, is it 6 or 5? I can't remember. Requires all NATO countries to come to the defense of the other. Whether they would do so, I don't know, but they're supposed to. So if he invaded Estonia, it would mean world war. It would mean war with Russia, and it would be the end. It would quickly escalate to nuclear war, or the danger of it. It ain't going to happen unless there's a provocation. And that's the thing, a false flag, as some people call it. We've got to be careful of false flags.
If I could, just 30 seconds. I do think that the annexation of Crimea leads a nation like Estonia to worry that it could be aggressed upon by Russia. But the distinctions are so big, it seems to me. Just Crimea might have well ended up a NATO seaport if there hadn't been the precipitous move and referendum. Estonia is a very different case. And in fact, there are already grievances growing inside Russia about the annexation of Crimea because of the cost of it and the feeling among ordinary Russians that they may be losing out because of the need to subsidize Crimea.
I can bring this down to the folksy level. I was discussing with the young man sitting over there basketball. I forgot your name. Remind me. Kalish. And I was asking him, because I'm a basketball junkie and he's into basketball, which of his California teams is favorite, and he wasn't committed. But to say that Putin would invade Estonia would be about like saying that the Lakers are going to trade LeBron for the 15th man on the bench of the New York Knicks. This is the level of probability. All right. Would you go along with me on that? There you go.
You got a convert.
I won him over. There you go. You got to start with the young generation.
I just a short little note when you think about the Baltic states, one of the things that's happened in the post-Soviet world is all these republics have very significant Russian populations, and the Baltic states actually have some of the most significant, and that's why it makes it a more complicated issue. Even though I fully agree with what Steve said, and I just don't see this happening, and I think that you see that a lot in the news where they're ascribing ideas to Putin, saying no, but he would never do that. The reverse, of course, is if the United States went into Ukraine, then yes, you would have you'd have a response within half a second. I mean, that I don't think would be otherwise. Right. All right, so let's have another question. So Russia has behaved more responsibly than the United States internationally. So why is there so much enmity towards Russia today in our political establishment? They're not taking enough Russian history classes here. That's what's happening.
That's what's going on. You guys got to sign up for more Russian history. Yeah. This is it. Well, there are different opinions about this. Do you all know the name John Mersheimer? He's probably one of our top 3 international professorial theorists of international relation. So he has a new book out, and he said that, you know, Russia and the United States simply act as traditional great powers in world affairs. They don't act according to morality, they act according to what they perceive to be their own great power interests. What was the last part of the question?
About the political establishment. Why the political establishment is so hostile to Russia.
Right, so I'll give you in a few sentences and I would call it my theory, not my certainty, but this is something that could be studied in an undergraduate paper or a dissertation, that it was assumed when the Soviet Union ended that the United States would now rule the world in the, you know, benign sense of the liberal world order. There was one, we use the expression, only one superpower. And this assumption was abetted, enhanced, and increased by the feeble leadership of Yeltsin in the 1990s. And then came Putin. And within a year or two, Putin began to push against this American view that there was one set of rules for the United States in the world and another set for everybody else. And Putin said, no, that's not the way it works. World relations between nations are a two-way street. Everybody makes concessions. No one dictates. The Washington establishment had a visceral reaction, negative, to Putin on that grounds. And you can look at editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post where Nicholas Kristof, for example, you know who he is, he writes a regular column in the Washington Post, literally wrote, and I quote this in the book, because he said out loud what I knew a lot of people in Washington were thinking, we were hoping for a sober Yeltsin.
Very quick.
That is a Russian leader who would be supplicant to the United States, but not drink so much. And instead they got Putin. And so Kristof said that he turned against Putin, he literally wrote this, when it became clear that Putin was not a sober Yeltsin. So the idea that Russia might thwart American hegemony, particularly in Europe, I think brought the growing hostility and then demonization of Putin to the Washington elites. Now, I may be wrong about that, but looking back, I didn't think that at the time, but looking back, because I've been asked the question often, I think that's what it was.
I would build on, there are 2 dates that are set in my mind. One was in 2007, if people know of the Munich Security Conference. It's an annual conference where the elites of the American political defense establishment meet their European counterparts. And it was the height of the Iraq War. And in the front row sat John McCain, Senator Joe Lieberman, and Putin spoke of what Steve said, that this is not a unipolar world, and America cannot define the world by its very own rules. The height of the Iraq War, which in my mind was one of the great disasters of U.S. foreign policy. The other date I would give is the day after the November 2016 election, which was a shock to the body politic. I mean, it was a shock. And I think that, with all due respect, people working around Clinton and those who had come out against Trump in the military, security, and other establishments needed a way to explain. And instead of what I would argue is so critical, which is to really look hard at the crises in this country, the American pathologies, the dark money, the voter suppression, the real crisis, I think, of our democracy, there was a decision, not conspiratorial, but just let's make Russia the scapegoat for the outcome of this election. And so there was a hyping of social media in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, states Hillary Clinton didn't visit, but there was just generally a shift to move away from the complicated, tormented inquiry that is needed to revive American democracy to blaming Russia for the outcome for electing Trump. And Trump is not just Trump. Trump is Trumpism. And by the way, it's also a global phenomenon as we see the rise of, ethno-reactionary populism across the globe. But I think those are 2 factors which explain why the establishment in this country has become so ferociously not just anti-Russian, but Russophobic.
Thank you, Katrina. When you brought up the ethnographic problems that are around, I guess, around the world right now, a lot of people too, they underestimate Russia is a multi-ethnic country. The empire was a multi-ethnic empire. If you go to Kazan, which is about 400 or 500 miles east of Moscow, it will have the largest mosque in Europe.
Yeah.
And that mosque is right near a church.
Yep.
And we never hear about this. And they have problems. Let's not pretend they don't have problems, but they have managed problems. And then one other quick comment. Putin always talks about a multipolar world. That is their idea. They have no illusion that they're going back to this Soviet bipolar world because they're much smaller than China.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a part of it as well. So here's another question. I think we'll have time for maybe one question after this one, if you're writing it down. The first US presidential election of the Gorbachev era was 1988. Would history have been profoundly different if the US had elected a thoughtful president in November 1988? Say US Senator Gary Hart. I understand you traveled with him in December 1986 to Moscow, where Hart held meetings with Gorbachev. Can you recall for us what those meetings were like?
Her recollection is, because we often, and I'd been out of touch with Gary until about quite a while, until a couple months ago, that Gary was a great devotee of Tolstoy. And he wanted to go to Tolstoy's home, Yasna Polyana. And it was maybe the coldest bloody day in history in Russia. And neither Katrina nor I wanted to go. But everybody in the room traveling with Gary, there were about 5 of us, thought Gary was going to be the next president of the United States. So Gary wanted to go, and we all went, okay, we all want to go. You know, it was this crazy deference to power. And we traveled, and we spoke. Katrina and I rode in the car with Gary. There were like 3 cars, as I recall. We had a police escort. But it was still about a 3-hour trip, is that right? We stopped for lunch?
We didn't stop for lunch. There was a 15-course lunch with the local officials with about 40 rounds of vodka.
Didn't we stop at Tula?
Yeah, and there were 15 courses and 40 rounds of vodka.
I mean, Gary took seriously, Senator Hart took seriously Gorbachev's concept of new thinking.
Yeah.
So you got to remember, you got to go back to when Gorbachev came to power in 1985. That the Soviet establishment was committed to ossified dogmatic thinking about policy at home, but particularly about policy abroad. Briefly put, the old Soviet leadership's elite's concept was Cold War forever, because it's the natural way of relations between the United States and Russia. And Gorbachev, because he had around him a circle of new thinking intellectuals who had been around him 4 or 5 years before he came to power, had developed new thinking, the root of which was that Cold War, in fact, is not the natural or necessary, let's say, and that we need is a whole new relationship. And that led him to new thinking about nuclear weapons, about, as Katrina mentioned, security instead of NATO from, what did he say, Lisbon to the Urals, which, by the way, is something de Gaulle has said. You remember, de Gaulle never put, am I right, Chris? De Gaulle never put the French army under NATO control. Isn't that right?
I think that's right.
He never put the NATO. So de Gaulle was a NATO skeptic. France was in NATO, but he was a skeptic. He wasn't going to let NATO drag France into a war de Gaulle didn't want. Gorbachev, these new ideas had been in the air for 20 or 30 years, and they made their way. They migrated to Moscow. And so Gorbachev had this new thinking. Gary's conceit, and I say that in a positive sense, was that he was the American new thinker.
Yeah.
So he fell in love with the idea of Gorbachev. And his idea was, Gary's idea was, spelled out to us as we rode to Yasnaya Polyana, and my recollection was it was about a 3-hour drive, I don't remember, was that he and Gorbachev could change the world. He and Gorbachev could change the world. Gary even had this idea that he was going to bring to his inauguration the Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Some of you remember that. And I said to him, Gary, I'm not sure that's the greatest idea. We love Zhenya, we love him to death, known him for years, but I'm not sure you start off bringing to a traditional American ceremony a Russian poet. Maybe you wait and invite him to the White House about a year after you've captured the White House. But Gary's idea was, and this is interesting because we've kind of lost it in America, that ideas, not just like, you know, healthcare for all, but larger ideas transform the world, or can. Gary believed that. Gorbachev believed it. In that sense, maybe they were both holy fools. I don't know. But that was what that moment was when Katrina and I traveled with Gary Hart to Gorbachev's Soviet Union. And I look back on that period.
We were not in the meetings, however. The meeting with Gorbachev was one that Gary brought his daughter with him to, Andrea.
That's right. We prepared Gary, we debriefed him, and the rest. But the point is that I think that was a lost opportunity there, that we never seized the opportunity that was Gorbachev. Though, to his credit, Reagan tried. He tried very, very, very hard, and wisely, because he had wise advisors around him. And there was a moment there where we could have ended, I think, the Cold War, but we didn't. But whoever knew we went with him brings back a flood of memories and a kind of sadness, because Gary goes down, Gorbachev is essentially ousted, and the clock starts all over again. And here we are.
And healthcare for all is a big, bold idea.
It's a bumper sticker.
I know it's not a bumper
for.
sticker,
Yeah,
it's a big real.
I have good health care, I'm all right. Somebody asked me, what's it mean to be professor emeritus at 2 universities? How do you do that? Well, you get old and you get a lot of health care. I'm okay, Jack.
So is there any other questions or anything like that? Okay, so one more question. We'll make this the... Thank you. Thank you so much. So here's the question. How should the U.S. media cover contemporary issues involving Russia in a way that does not demonize or hinder constructive U.S.-Russian relations? Katrina?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking there's so many stories to be told. Profile some of the new activists. There are activists in Russia. There are people who are on the left or on the right. Profile the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church and why the church is playing such an important role in Putin's Russia. Step away, if you can, from the two main pillars of Russia coverage in the mainstream media, Putin and demonization of Putin, and Russiagate, because there are stories about there should be many more stories about the nuclear issue. I remember in 1982 there were 1 million people in Central Park protesting the intermediate nuclear range missiles, which that treaty is now about to be rolled back. Let's get some real coverage about, for example, who's the nuclear program. Let's get some coverage about how Russia's handling the climate crisis. Let's get some coverage about those who are combating oligarchical corruption. There are stories to be told. I'd love to see a story on the history of meddling, both Russian and American. We've in the 90s we forgot to talk about the U.S. meddling in the Yeltsin election, which was a major public story. I'd love to see stories, and in fact, the Nation is doing this. We have a Russian independent journalist who writes a monthly letter from Moscow. Her next letter is about women protesting wars. The Chechen War, the rehabilitation of the Afghan War in Russia, and the Mothers Movement to bring back soldiers from special operations Russia's involved with. There's a lot happening that could be covered if there was a will and a way to get away from the demonization and the Russiagate story.
You know, we use this expression, alternative media, which means, I guess, that in addition to the mainstream media, say the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the cable news stations, that there's another set of media outlets that present alternative points of view. And it's true. But the Nation magazine is very interesting. And I was actually writing for the Nation before I met Katrina. So this is not all about Katrina. It's a lot about Katrina, because she's probably been the best editor in the history
It was not
It's probably time for her to take a break. She's been editor, what, 25 years?
almost 25 years, yeah.
Hard to look at her. I mean, the woman, I don't know how she does it. But the Nation is a semi-mainstream media outlet in that the Nation is read inside the Beltway. They don't write for it all that much, except a few exceptional Congress people, stuff like that. But the Nation, unlike some alternative media, is actually read. So if you go to thenation.com and you look, for example, she has a story leading her most popular list for about 4 days, right? About the role being played by neo-Nazi battalions, but fascism in general in Ukraine.
In Ukraine,
It's very alarming. There's only one country in Europe that is witnessing a resurgence of fascism today. And that doesn't make us, well, you could do this.
Hungary is too in different.
Oh, come on.
It is.
The guy, I mean, you talk about Orban, I mean, please. I mean, these guys got guns. They're armed. They're 3,000 battalions. I mean, this is serious. And I mean, imagine a resurgence of fascism in Europe. If Ukraine really is, as we claim, a Central European country, 40 million people, all the rest, we should be concerned. But the New York Times and the Washington Post scarcely write a word about this. So what's going on is they have a narrative. It's been established. I don't know if it's established by the corporate ownerships, the top editors, or by kind of just understanding by their journalists that this is what is wanted. And everything that doesn't fit is excluded from the narrative. In the book, I mock the Times. They say, its slogan is, all the news that's fit to print. And I say, no, it's the news that fits. Because they omit so much. It's not that they lie. It's what they don't publish. So that's the main problem with mainstream media coverage today of Russia, Putin, and Russiagate, I think, and it's dangerous. So if you are determined to try to find alternative perspectives, and I don't say they're right or righteous, but just alternative perspectives, and you know when somebody's bullshitting and somebody really knows something, you can tell that right away. Then there's a whole array of, quote, alternative media that you can click right on your computer. And I'm not much of a computer guy, but I mean, even I can do it. And of course, the leading source, and I really don't say this because of Katrina, but because it's true that the Nation has an enormous following online and with its magazine. I don't know why you're rolling your eyes. I mean, it's a heavy responsibility.
I was taking a deep breath.
Well, you're not allowed to breathe right now. So, but it's not only the Nation. There are other places. And if somebody wants to know, there's even a newsletter that comes out once a day called Johnson's Russia List, which you can get free. You just write to David and ask for it.
It's worth looking at as an aggregation of 30, 40 Russia-related stories from Western media, Russian media.
It's in English. And when there's a good translation when there's a translation of a really important Russian article, puts it in there. But he goes to all the available English language sources, so you really get, and he doesn't exclude stuff he doesn't like. He's Quaker, he's kind of down with peace and all that, but he puts everything in. The point of it is that we're in a situation now where it wasn't like it was where you could count on the newspaper you always count on. You gotta go looking now for news, and it takes a little effort. But the computer makes it fairly easy. I will end by saying this, that I have done media criticism as part of my writings, going back to a book I published in 2000 called Failed Crusade. And I think it is worse today and more dangerous than it's ever been. Why that's so, I don't know. But I could show you, I'll give you one example. The language they use. Putin made a trip to some East European country about 6 months ago. And the Times wrote, literally, the news account, Putin swaggered into Hungary. What do you mean he swaggered in? I mean, they use a certain language that they wouldn't use for other countries. So this is the kind of thing that makes, if you want to be a citizen, you sort of got to take it upon yourself to go looking for don't stop reading the Times of the Post, but read other things too.
All right, well, thank you so much. A big round of applause.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think this will talk about the rest of the program.
Okay, so we have
book signing available right outside the door, and please join us for a reception. And let's once again thank the Doshis.
Thank you.